Well, welcome to the CRADLE seminar series, and I'd like to welcome those of you who are in the room at Deakin downtown, and I'd also like to welcome all of those of you who are online. Just to start by acknowledging the country we're on and the traditional custodians. We're on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and we'd like to pay a deep respect to the ancestors and elders of those people whose land we sit on today, and to all those in other parts of Australia whose land you're sitting on. I'm very pleased today to welcome you to this particular seminar from Liesbeth Baartman. Liesbeth is partly from the University of Applied, which one is it? Utrecht, yes. Oh yeah, Applied Sciences Utrecht, but also from Maastricht University, which is joined, or is it rejoined recently? Yeah. So what we have is a talk about programmatic assessment from someone from the country that developed it. The origins of it come from the Netherlands, and now someone who was working in the institution that was the great innovator in programmatic assessment right way back decade or so ago. I think it's interesting to look at this topic because this is one of the fast-growing emergent topics of interest in the whole of assessment in higher education. And it's growing for a number of different reasons. It originally grew because there was a desire for programs that more effectively prepared students to be practitioners in the area in which they were enrolled. And we are all very aware of the unbelievable deficiencies of many of our present assessment practices that don't enable us to tell whether someone is a suitable practitioner. There's also been the concern, particularly in Australia, and the desire in the light of higher education standards that our students should meet the program learning outcomes and that we can be assured that they've done that. Again, this is something we're all required to do by TEXA, but there's a kind of a bit of a gap between, there's a slip between the ideal and the practice at the moment. So a lot of people are scrambling to kind of move into that space, both through the idea of programmatic assessment and through other practices that are a bit like it. And we might take that up in discussion about programmatic assessment and course-wide assessment and other things. And finally, the other impetus recently is this concern about generative AI. It's been mooted by some people in the room here, indeed, that programmatic assessment can be one way of assisting us to address some of the concerns about. That's Margaret Bierman. If everyone, and she is not a manifestation of generative AI. Although she's a great practitioner in that area, so we weren't using your shot as an illustration of the issue. So that's a kind of a recent thing that's come on board. So I'd like to welcome Liesbeth. We'll be using the normal format. So Liesbeth will talk for about 3/4 of an hour. There will be then discussion alternating between the room and online. After an hour, we will break and we will formally end the proceedings there, but we will continue both in the room and online in case there are any other questions, and then we will stop when the questions dry up. So over to you, Liesbeth.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. So my name is Liesbeth Baartman, and first I would like to thank David and all CRADLE team members for inviting me to come to Melbourne and to visit you and I will be here for a month to explore programmatic assessment, further collaborations, etc. And I'm really, really looking forward to it. So as Dave already told, I work at two institutions, Utrecht University of Applied Sciences, in which I work as a professor of the research group focusing on professional and vocational education. And I specialize in assessment issues. And I recently joined indeed Maastricht University, which is very exciting, I think, as it's, well, like Dave told, the programmatic assessment originates in Maastricht. And for example, Kees van der Vleuten was one of my PhD supervisors by that time. And you might know Lambert Schuweert, for example, who also worked there. So very excited. As you know, I'm not a native speaker, so I really hope I can make myself clear. And well, please feel free to ask if you don't understand. I might use like different or the wrong terminology, other terminology than you are used to, but I hope you understand the story, and I'm very pleased to answer any questions. I'll be talking about programmatic assessment, the why, the what, and the how. So I would like to start with like the origins of programmatic assessment. I think it's important to first start with the question, why did we consider programmatic assessment? And then I will go on with the what it is, the principles of programmatic assessment, or so to say, the essentials. And in the Netherlands, we have quite a lot of experience with programmatic assessment. I run quite a large community of practice with about 50 programs, courses, and I think there are many, many more who do programmatic assessment in practice. And we do practice-based research to learn from their experiences. And one of the examples is that we investigated the design choices they made in their own context to make programmatic assessment work. Yes, so to start with, I thought I would start with the idea of learning for a profession, because that's what we are doing in many courses. So I'm talking about professional courses, and I also work in vocational education courses. So what's learning for a profession like? We think our view on learning, which is a social cultural perspective on learning. So we think learning for a profession is situated in social practice. It's about participation in a community of practice in which you grow in gradually. And it's such a community of practice usually has a shared understanding of what good practice looks like. So they would say, for example, you're going to be one of us, and we can judge what good practice is like in our specific context, in our specific profession. So that's what learning for a profession looks like. And then professional practice is quite complex. So it's usually unpredictable. Protocols might not be sufficient to determine what good work looks like. And people always have to rely, therefore, on their personal subjective judgments of what good work looks like. And when you look at this, so learning for a profession, complex professional practice, and then we turn to assessment, what we tend to do is assessment. We want it to be objective, comparable across several students. They all have to do the same. Standardization. We tend to set up detailed lists of assessment criteria, which might be very specific. And I think that doesn't really align with the idea of professional practice, which is complex, in which you have to make personal judgments, in which judgments are not the same. There's not like one good solution to a problem. And when learning is about growing into a community of practice, becoming a member of this community and sharing their ideas and their values and their practices, I think this is not the kind of assessment that really aligns very well. So that's one of the starting points why we started to look for different ways of assessing students to be able to better judge whether they are ready for professional practice. So I inserted this slide, as I had this discussion with David and some other Deakin people about what you would probably call a course-wide approach to assessment or a program-wide approach to assessment. When you look at the history of what we did with regard to research on assessment, I think we started with single assessment instruments, the validity, the reliability, and looking for like the one instrument that could capture what we wanted to measure. Then we moved to multiple assessments in a program. That's what I did in Maastricht University, for example. During my PhD with Kees van der Vleuten, we moved from one assessment instrument to multiple instruments. So in a course-wide approach to assessment, you might look at the different assessments that you have within the different modules or units. What are they supposed to measure? Do they align? When you look at the entire picture, can you then indeed capture the intended learning outcomes? And then we went one step further towards systems of assessment. So I'd like to make a difference between an approach in the middle, an approach to course-wide, program-wide approach to assessment, and programmatic assessment is like one step further, because it's an entire system in which the different assessments are aligned. They work together to both ensure decision-making, so that would be the summative, the assessment of learning, and embedded in the learning process to stimulate assessment for learning, or the formative function of assessment. So I will turn to the why of programmatic assessment, in which I would like to address both the validity and reliability, because that was an important starting point, and the learning perspective, so the assessment for learning. But really, programmatic assessment started from discussions about the validity and reliability of single assessment methods. When you are working towards professional practice, you have, we call it learning outcomes in the Netherlands. You could also call it competencies, or, well, the complex learning outcomes that you would like students to achieve and to work towards. Then when you look at validity, one assessment instrument can never capture it all. So you need a multitude of different assessment methods. But that was the validity part. And for reliability, what you see on the slide is a screenshot. I modified it a bit from an article written by Kees and Lambert, in which they compared the reliability, you see reliability coefficients of different assessment methods. I'm not going into detail, but the main message that this table shows is that you see different methods of assessment, from multiple choice questions to written vignettes to simulations, towards, on the right-hand side, the incognito simulated patients. So what you see there is that assessment is coming like more authentic, from multiple choice to, at the other hand, very authentic real-life patients. And the other, you see the testing time in hours. And the main message that this table shows is that when you have very short testing time, that any assessment method is unreliable. You see 62, well, it should be, psychometricians would say that it should be about 0.80. So testing time is really important. But also when you see like testing time is 8 hours, and it doesn't mean it have to be an assessment of 8 hours in one that would be horrible, in one shot. So it's a testing time added up different assessments. But then you see that all different methods of assessment can be reliable as long as you have enough time. So the idea of combining multiple assessment methods and the idea that you need more time before you make a summative decision originates in this kind of research. And I will tell more about it later. So then the learning, of course. Student learning, I used a screenshot of one of the earlier Deakin seminars. This is by Jason Lodge. And I watched a couple of the seminars to get a bit acquainted with what you are doing. And I really like this picture as it shows how we tend to modularize our courses, and that learning is not something linear, but something that happens more in an unexpected, unpredictable way. So that it's not always helpful to have these assessments at the end of each module, because they really cannot always capture the learning progress that the student is making at that point, as it's more unpredictable than that. And also on the left-hand side, there's this picture. So you see students are working towards the intended learning outcomes. But what they experience is they like hop from one assessment to another. And we do a lot of research on formative assessment, assessment for learning. And then students mention things like, well, you got feedback on one assessment, but there's also a pass-fail decision involved. So why bother to use this feedback? I already passed, so why bother? And when they want to use the feedback in a next assignment, they often have difficulties doing that, as the next assessment or the next assignment will be on another topic. So we're trying to build bridges between the different assessment methods in a course or could be within a unit as well. So the starting points for programmatic assessment with regard to learning were that you need students to make meaning of assessment information, and also to focus on these longer term learning outcomes, these program learning outcomes, because that will allow them to build the bridges from one assessment to another and really use feedback. So across different assessments. So those were the starting points from a learning perspective. And then these are some examples from practice, from the programs we work with. And what they say, for example, when we ask them, why do you use programmatic assessment? They say, for example, I want to prevent students to hop from one assessment to another, focus on this long-term learning process, but also increase self-regulation and employability. So they really want students to focus on what can assessment mean for me in the future. For example, when I will go to different employers, can I be able to show them what I know and what I can do? So that's a quote. We started with our practical dilemmas and not with the idea to implement programmatic assessment. And it's an important one to me, because I never ever say to anyone, you have to do programmatic assessment, like it's the best solution for everyone. It's quite complex to implement programmatic assessment. And when it really fits your idea of how learning should occur, if you really want to focus on employability, etc., then it's a good idea. Oh, it already automatically went to the next slide. What just happened is that I think I wasn't paying any attention, but I think you saw these articles appearing. So these are some of the articles that were written mainly in the medical domain, medical education, on the principles of programmatic assessment. So it originates in medical education. And what I'm trying to do is to translate the theories and experiences from medical education to other professional domains. So I'm going to share with you the programmatic assessment, so the theoretical principles. And these are some examples of articles we wrote. And you also see this book. Unfortunately, it's written in Dutch only, so it might be a bit difficult. We're negotiating with the editor, or maybe they can translate it to English. And it contains examples of programmatic assessment in practice. So these are the principles of programmatic assessment. And I won't read them out now as we will go through them in the next slides. And again, I will organize the presentation of the principles according to assessment of learning and assessment for learning, as programmatic assessment aims to optimize both. So it's not only assessment for learning. There's this new article on programmatic assessment for learning now, and which is called PAL. And I thought I don't completely agree, as I think it's really both. So we got this picture that I sometimes use to explain programmatic assessment when I work with teachers of different courses. And an important message that you can see in this picture is that students follow a kind of learning pathway towards the intended learning outcomes. And on the way, they gather information about their learning process, what they can and what they can't do. And those are called data points in programmatic assessment. So they collect their data points usually in a portfolio, which is represented by the wheelbarrow in the picture. And on the way, they also have they collect feedback all the time, and they discuss feedback with their teachers or their mentors or their coaches to stimulate assessment for learning. And in the end, there's a professional judgment, usually by, we call it an assessment committee or a decision-making committee. So multiple members who look at all the evidence in the portfolio and make a holistic decision. But I will go into it a bit further, but that's the main idea. So before going into the assessment of learning, this is like one of the main starting points is you see this picture. I always use the Mona Lisa picture. I have some different pictures of other people as well. So like Vermeers, the girl with the pearl earring. I also got a nice picture of her. But this is Mona, so she could be a student. And the basic idea of programmatic assessment is represented in a sense that a pixel would be one assessment or one assessment method. And in this metaphor, you can see that one pixel doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't paint the whole picture about the student. So you need multiple pixels, before you can make a high stakes summative decision. That's the idea of time, that you need more time and more assessment methods before you know enough about the student to make a decision. And then you see the difference between low stakes and high stakes. So we differentiate between low stakes decisions, and those are decisions that have little consequences for students. So based on one pixel or one data point, as we call it, you do not make any pass-fail decisions, but the main focus is feedback, so assessment for learning. Then in the middle, there's intermediate. Based on multiple data points, you kind of get a rough picture of where the student is going. You got more information, and this focuses on diagnosis and setting new learning goals together with the student. And then on the right-hand side, the high stakes decisions. So those are the pass-fail decisions. And you need multiple data points. And a high stakes decision, as I said, is usually made by a committee. So this is the idea of the mix of data points. And I think really one of the essentials of programmatic assessment is that no pass-fail decisions are made based on one assessment, so on one data point. But then what is a data point? And I usually describe it as an artifact. And an artifact could be something a student does or makes or develops. So it could be a presentation. It could even be what we regard as a knowledge test. So a knowledge test could be a data point, but then remember, no high stakes decisions are being made based on a knowledge test. But it could also be an observation in practice. It could involve feedback from customers, clients, patients, so all stakeholders involved in what the student is doing or making. So very important in programmatic assessment, and you see the question marks coupled to the artifact. So a data point is not just the artifact, but it's also the opinions of the different stakeholders with regard to how well the student did. And this is usually done by means of feedback forms, assessment criteria. So the student delivers a piece of work and asks teachers, peers, other stakeholders, clients, etc., to give feedback on their work using this feedback or assessment form. And this feedback, in my opinion, is nothing else than a judgment about how well the student has done. And that's what when we come to the high stakes decisions, this is very important to remember, as high stakes decisions are not made by the assessment committee alone, but they are based on the multitude of data points together with the judgments. So that's the idea of triangulation in programmatic assessment. When it comes to assessment quality, we use a lot of concepts from qualitative research, like this triangulation. So you got triangulation based on different data points, the artifacts, based on the different feedback perspectives, and those are the question marks, and multiple assessors in the end. So that brings me to programmatic assessment of learning. So the high stakes decisions made at the end. And they are based on three important ideas: meaningful aggregation of information, the number of data points needed for decision making, and intersubjectivity. And I will go into that a bit further. So this is the aggregation thing. That is, how do we usually aggregate assessment information? And how we are used to doing it goes like this. So you got one assessment, whatever assessment method that may involve, and that assessment method covers some learning outcomes, in this case A, B, and D. And at the end of a unit, a student gets a mark, or pass, fail, or below sufficient. I don't know what we use marks from 1 to 10. I don't know exactly what you use, but that's how we usually do it. So at the end of a unit, the different, well, you just get a mark for an assessment, and in which different learning outcomes are like combined into that mark. But you can't see anymore whether the students did well on learning outcome A and very poorly on D. It's just aggregated into one mark. Well, that happens several times. So you get several marks, and then those are usually, well, an average will be calculated, or you have to have a sufficient mark for all of the modules, and then the student will be able to graduate or get a certificate or diploma, etc. So, I'm used to doing it like that. But in programmatic assessment, it works the other way around, because the learning outcomes are central. And that's what we call the backbone of learning outcomes. So again, the same picture, learning outcomes, A, B, D, same picture again, but then information is aggregated across the learning outcomes. So vertically instead of horizontally, because we want to know how well the student did on learning outcome A, and not combine it into one mark that doesn't show you anymore how well the student did on one learning outcome versus the other. So this happens for all learning outcomes. So on the left-hand side, that would be the data points. So you have different data points, and not all data points cover all learning outcomes. That's impossible. But you need enough data points for all learning outcomes to monitor student progress, and in the end, make a decision. You can make a decision about each learning outcome, but often this is done more holistically. That's a debate sometimes. So, but importantly, this is how aggregation of assessment information works in programmatic assessment. Then we go to the second idea of saturation of information. And saturation in qualitative research means that new information doesn't add anything. And it doesn't change the decision you would make about the student. So it goes like this. You got some pieces of information, some data points. More, hey, you see the green one appeared. Then some more. And then you reach, in this example, you have reached saturation as no more information is needed. And saturation is in the eye of the beholder. So it's not something you can define beforehand. I always get the question, how many data points do I need? But the sad thing, and of course people are never satisfied with the answer, is I can't tell, because it depends on saturation. And of course you can get like an estimate of how many you would need, but it really depends on the student. And this is really like balancing between how many data points you need and how much you design in a program, because if you have not enough data points, you will have not enough information to validly and reliably make a high stakes decision. But on the other hand, when you got like an enormous amount of data points, that'll be a really high workload for teachers, for assessors who have to give feedback, the question marks, on all the different data points. And we studied this, and students will experience it as a bureaucracy, and they will only tend to hunt for data points and hunt for good feedback. And they will have no time to even use the feedback, as they're constantly hunting for data points. So this is really a delicate balance between enough data points for decision making, but not too much to get the negative effects. And this idea that saturation is in the eye of the beholder, we studied this or a colleague of mine, Lebetta, she studied this in an assessment committee, and they used manipulated portfolios. They were borderline portfolios, which contained low or high quality feedback and low or high quality reflection of the student. And what they found is that this perception of saturation depends on the quality of the feedback. So when feedback quality is high, assessors more easily feel that they reached saturation, meaning that they know enough about the student. And they look for discrepancies in the information. That's what assessors do when they got a portfolio like this, with all different kind of artifacts and different feedback from different stakeholders. So they look for discrepancies, like this is a strange, an odd one out, like the student always gets positive feedback and here I got a negative one. What could be the reason? And when this whole set of information is like more, I'm looking for the word, is pointing in the same direction, then you more easily reach saturation. So when a student does well on one occasion and not so well on the other, and it's really a mixed picture, then also in qualitative research, you would need more information. And that's what the assessors do. So when they get a portfolio they are not sure about, that's got a really mixed picture of the student, they say, I need more eyes. I need to discuss this portfolio within the entire assessment committee. I need another assessor to take a look at this. So that's how high stakes decisions are made. So it's a holistic professional judgment based on all data points together, which is important to contain both qualitative and quantitative information, based on multiple judgments by multiple assessors or feedback givers along the way. That's what I told about the artifacts and the feedback connected to the artifacts. And then you usually have this decision-making committee, as we call it, a committee of different assessors who usually use a stepwise procedure. So, for example, a portfolio is first judged by 2 assessors. When they agree and they think we reached saturation, we got enough information, we are sure enough about our decision, then the decision is being made, pass, fail. And if not, it's discussed in the entire committee. And research also shows that these committee members need to be trained and they need to develop shared mental models, as it's holistic, about what constitutes good practice. So to say that the assessment criteria are usually formulated in quite a holistic way to allow different data points. So that's it about the assessment of learning. So now we move to assessment for learning, just as important. And in assessment for learning, we want these data points to be optimized for feedback. And we need a dialogue about the data points, as students do not automatically interpret and use feedback. They need to be supported. And often they want to stimulate self-regulation and evaluative judgments so students can interpret the information from the data points themselves, get the messages from the data points, like this is what people tell me about my work and this is what I need to improve. And this is what the picture shows. The little cycle you see is a formative assessment cycle that we developed in another bunch of research projects. And we're trying to use this formative assessment cycle in programmatic assessment, as well as it helps teachers and students with concrete actions on how to act on the feedback. So I'd like to come back to this backbone of learning outcomes, so this path that you saw in the first picture. And we did this research in which we developed a so-called learning progression together with some teacher teams. And they developed something like this. We had 4 teams and they developed different visualizations. Like, I don't know if it's an expression in English, but in Dutch we call it, you encounter certain bears on your path. So that's what the bears in this picture represent. It's like the problems students usually encounter. Some obstacles are they could like be predicted, like many students will run into this. So that's what the picture here represents. And we did this to like build this learning pathway together with the teachers, to stimulate decision-based data collection and create a landing space for feedback. So one assignment would build on the other to enable students to interpret and use feedback in a subsequent assignment. And what I told you about aggregation, I kind of connected it to assessment of learning, but it's just as important for assessment for learning. And these are some screenshots of the portfolios used by different programs. So you can see, for example, this pathway of how well the line means, it's in Dutch, of course. So the line means the performance they are striving for. So sometimes the student is below and then above. And the one below there is the feedback, which is in Dutch, of course. The feedback collected by a student, and in the portfolio, you can, for example, organize it per learning outcome or per feedback giver. So you can, for example, say, show me all the feedback I got from fellow students versus all the feedback I got from teachers, so you can compare it. And what happens, we studied students' perceptions of this learning function of assessment for learning in programmatic assessment. And what they reported in this study, and this is one of the programs in our professional learning community, the students reported that they experience a daily feedback culture. Feedback is kind of normal. The quality of feedback, it was kind of funny actually, because the students at first complained about the quality of the feedback given by the teachers, but that was because they were really trained in feedback literacy. So asking for feedback and giving feedback, they were trained to do that during their course. And the teachers, of course, also were trained, but then the students became very critical toward the teachers. Like they said, oh, but this is not how it's supposed to be. So, I kind of liked it. And so what the students did with regard to feedback seeking was they make a distinction between inquiry and monitoring in feedback seeking literature. And inquiry would be to ask for feedback. And that is what most students did, also because they were required to do so by the program. So they said, like, you need this many feedback perspectives in your portfolio. What they reported as positive is this planned and required feedback seeking. And in this particular study, they really focused on, like, this is required. It's not something they experienced as negative. But in another study, students reported that at the beginning, they thought it was kind of necessary for them to be required to seek feedback, but then later on they would do it like more automatically. It became like a habit to ask for feedback. Another positive thing in the design of this specific program were the mentor or coach groups. We call them learning teams. So groups of like 8 to 10 students who sit together with a teacher on a weekly basis, and they discuss feedback in their portfolio, and they experienced it as a safe environment in which they learn to ask for feedback and interpret feedback. And the interesting thing, the negative point in this research was that students felt the need to pass data points, whereas in fact, one of the most important things about programmatic assessment is that no pass-fail distinctions are connected to individual data points. But there was this little design thing in this program which wasn't completely correct, you could say, because they had this required thing that about like 5 data points had to be sufficient, as they called it, before students could send their portfolio to the decision-making committee. So there was this kind of, indeed, that some data points had to be passed. So it immediately had this effect on students that they experienced it in that way. And also that when they needed to pass the data points, they didn't use the feedback anymore. And some quotes. I like this way of assessing. You get feedback, you can build further on that. It gives you a feeling of a professional atmosphere. So as opposed to like a school atmosphere. And it's much more than preparing for an assessment and then pause and move on. And also about this feedback culture, you hear it everywhere around you. It's a kind of normal for students. And another study we did, I wanted to mention, is the programmatic feedback literacy. So in programmatic assessment, feedback has a dual purpose. So it's meant for learning, but it also goes into the portfolio and will be used for making high-stakes decisions later on. So here we studied what students experience with regard to feedback literacy needed in programmatic assessment. It hasn't been published yet. We presented it as at one of the conferences. And to be a bit short about this, the students appreciated feedback when it was specific, when it was connected to this backbone, and they didn't appreciate feedback as it focused on demonstrating. So on the, like, I need this many feedback in my portfolio, and it has to be in the portfolio, and it has to be this so many, etc. Then students experienced anxiety, and it was interesting as these students were in their 4th year, but they had 3 years of experience in like a conventional assessment program. So in their 4th year, they suddenly moved to programmatic assessment, or they decided to implement it in the 4th year. And maybe that's not a real good idea. The students need to like get to know the system. And this quote shows the balance that students and teachers are looking for between learning and decision making. So they have conversations about feedback, but on the other hand, a student wants to know, oh, am I going in the right direction? Am I doing well? So I realized, how much time have I got left, David?
Very little.
Very little. Always way too much to tell. I have to be very short about this. The design choices that programs make with regard to programmatic assessment, manifestations and practice, and we studied their design considerations. So why did they choose to design programmatic assessment in that way? And this was done in the professional learning community I just told you about. Methodology, can be very short about that, but the thing I wanted to mention is that indeed different professional domains were included here, as this professional learning community consists of people from different professional domains. And we found 4 generic design choices so that all programs applied. They all had this backbone. They used a mix of different data points. They used a portfolio, and they implemented a system of student guidance to help them to interpret and use feedback. And in another study, we found that all programs have feedback from different perspectives and multiple decision makers in this committee, which kind of makes sense. And then we found 11 context-specific design choices, so which varied across the different programs. And we were trying to find differences between professional domains, but so far we didn't find any. I was discussing this yesterday here. There are 3 categories. So they differed with regard to how much freedom of choice students got. So can they choose the data points, or does the program lay down what data points students have to gather? The same with regard to feedback perspectives and the timing. So when they could ask for feedback. Is it completely free? Could mean high workload, or really planned, but could not fit the student needs. The types of data points, knowledge tests, whether they are used or not, and high stakes decision making. One thing to mention, maybe to get an impression of programmatic assessment, is quarterly, half yearly, yearly. So that's about the amount of time that is used to gather enough data points for decision making. And I wouldn't say that quarterly is quite a short period of time already. So better half yearly or yearly. I have to skip this. Teacher-student experiences, positive, but they do experience it as a paradigm shift. And this is the last one, don't worry, David. I wanted to end with this nice picture of the ducks, which represents in the middle the principles of programmatic assessment, but then again, that using these principles, you can build like different designs fitting your own context. So thanks.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Liesbeth. That was very stimulating and opening up an area that some of us have just looked at a little, and it's showing how rich and interesting things are there. Say one thing to the people online first. Make sure your questions are in Q&A, and make sure you've upticked the questions you would most like to see asked in the session. I'd like to take the indulgence of asking the first question myself. A lot of people have kind of approached programmatic assessment, and they've seen a lot of the benefits and a lot of the achievements of it, but they become, after a while, a bit intimidated by it. And I think this is more than we can cope with in my kind of program. I wondered if you could comment something on that issue of moving it from an area where there's a lot of investment in assessment and a lot of practice in that area, that is medicine, to other areas where the level of investment in assessment activities is much less, and the fear of the workload that people might have.
I think I'll have to move up here again.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you won't be able to hear me. Thanks for the question, David. It's an important one. What we see in practice is that people take one approach or another. Some people start with decision making, so they're kind of not satisfied with the way their assessments are organized or with the validity or the reliability. And so they start designing decision making in a different way, but not focusing so much on the assessment for learning aspect yet. And you see it the other way around. So people start with formative assessment, assessment for learning. So they are investing in feedback literacy development, in building this sequence of learning tasks to help students. But they don't alter the decision making yet. And just from experience, we didn't really study this. There are positive and negative things about both approaches. When you start with the assessment for learning, then you see that teachers become dissatisfied with decision making because they think, oh, we got this very nice assessment for learning process, and then we got suddenly like a standardized assessment at the end that doesn't fit what we were doing along the way. And the other way around, it's the same, that they change to the decision-making procedure and then they figure out, oh, but that's kind of strange because this is what we expect from students at the end, but we don't really guide them throughout the way to get there. So I see both approaches, and it also has to do with the time investments that people or programs choose. Like, this is most important for us. We want to focus on assessment for learning, for example, so they start with that. And specifically in vocational education in the Netherlands, they started with the decision-making as they were really, really unsatisfied with the way it was organized there. Hope it answers a bit.
Yes, thank you. We'll take one question from the room and then we go to one question online. Phil.
Let's go. All right. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I have reams of notes here. So great. I love the notion of pixels. And, we're trying to build up a high resolution picture of what the student's capable of. I think at the moment, with the rise of generative AI and integrity concerns and all of that stuff, people aren't trusting all of the pixels anymore. Some people would say there's only actually a few pixels across a whole standard university degree you can trust. What do we do with the other pixels that we might not trust? How do we view them as still useful data in aggregate form? Do we discard them and have a picture made up of 3 or 4 pixels?
Yeah, thanks. That's of course a very good question. And I know that here in Australia, this TEXA report has been released in which programmatic assessment has been mentioned as a possible, like, a solution to Gen AI problems with regard to assessment. In the Netherlands, we got this discussion as well with regard to plagiarism, or should we then like scan all data points, put them in this system, etc. But then for Gen AI, that wouldn't work at all. So what I personally think, we didn't study this yet, so it's just my experience, is that as assessment is so much embedded in the learning process, that you would notice. But actually, the answer I would like to give is that I want students to use Gen AI. So it should be incorporated in the program anyway. I would much more prefer that we teach students on how to use Gen AI properly. And with regard to evaluative judgment, that they can judge the quality of what Gen AI is producing. And you can only do that when you develop evaluative judgment and can have like content knowledge yourself, have an idea of what good work is like. So if you connect this to programmatic assessment and you ask students to self-evaluate their work, alongside the feedback of different other stakeholders. I think it would the risks would be less. Of course, a student could make up an entire portfolio, like ask Gen AI to produce the feedback for you, to produce the assignments, etc., etc. But when you also got this mentoring system and discuss feedback, etc., I cannot imagine that it wouldn't be discovered. We had one case in the Netherlands in one of the universities in which a student indeed made up an entire portfolio, and it had been discovered. But, well, in general, I think the most important is to help students in learning how to use Gen AI. I mean, we don't say anymore like you can't use the internet anymore, and for assessment purposes, we got to lock you up in a room and close down the Wi-Fi, etc. I mean, that's not what it would work like.
Thank you. Just to remind everyone, well, what we do is we have a 1 hour in which we will formally keep the session going. And then after that hour occurs, we will continue informally. So we've got one more opportunity for one more question during that 1 hour. And then I will formally close the proceedings, but we will continue both in the room and online to respond to any other questions that are still available. So Jack, you're monitoring the online people. What's come up there?
So I'm going to go to a question from Matthew Hillier, which I think is reflective of a lot of the conversation that's happened in the chat and plays out through some of the questions as well. And Matthew's question is, do you have comments on the applicability of programmatic assessment to programs with less vertical integration, i.e., where there is a wide range of student choice in the program compared to medical ed programs where the program is tightly integrated?
Let me check whether I understood the question correctly. I heard like 2 elements in it. Like, do you have vertical integration? One, as I told you, I never say like everybody's got to do programmatic assessment. And this is one of the issues in which I tend to say no. When you got a program made up of units or modules that are different subjects each time, and also that teachers feel very much attached to their own subject, that would be quite problematic. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would mean a huge change for teachers as well to let go of like your assessment of your unit. And it would mean that students do not have to pass your assessment. Well, that's a big challenge. So that's when I tend to say, maybe it's not a good idea for you. And the other one I forgot. There was another element in the question.
The question was whether you had comments on the applicability of programmatic assessment to programs with less vertical integration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember there was another element I wanted to comment on, but I just forgot. Sorry about that.
Good. Thank you very much, Liesbeth. I now want to wrap up the formal part of the proceedings. But before I do, just give you a little advert for the next in the CRADLE seminar series. And the topic is Gen AI. We're going back to Gen AI again, and effective feedback. And we're having a mixed presentation from 2 people from CRADLE. That's Tom Corbin and Joe Tai, and Jean Flenady from Monash. And the focus there will be, what is the role of Gen AI in effective feedback? And that will be on Wednesday, the 9th of April at 2 p.m. So I hope you will see you all again there. And we will now continue both in the room and online for some more questions in the room.
So nothing really changes here. I don't have to do anything, anything special.
I'll jump in because I've got the mic and I've got a question. So you've spoken a bit about some circumstances that you think where programmatic assessment is really, really difficult, or you would advise against. I wonder if you'd be prepared to discuss what you've seen as being sort of like, for people wishing to take this on, some of the practice challenges that you encounter, like the biggest ones that you encounter in this.
Yeah, good question. Let me think. I know many examples in the Netherlands from courses who are trying to implement programmatic assessment. I think I already mentioned this one about the teachers' beliefs and practices about assessment that can be quite challenging to alter. So what we usually advise people to do is to start with this why question. So sometimes we organize these sessions with the entire teacher team to go back to what's assessment like now and what would you like to change. So they come up with all different things that they don't like about assessment and that they would like assessment to stimulate, etc. And when this is the starting point, you got like a common ground where to start from and to come back to during the design process. And another one is that the programmatic assessment is usually being designed by like a smaller group of teachers, so not everybody. Would be very unpractical, but to take along everybody along the way. So not like get this smaller team locked up in a room and then come out like this is it. This is what we developed and this is what you're going to do. So, and also once it's implemented, like with every innovation, I think in the first year, you will encounter many problems. And usually after the first year, we see that people change a couple of things. One is this data point issue, like the number of data points that I mentioned. Usually programs have too many data points. And I can imagine as it feels a bit risky to not have enough data points for high stakes decision making. So we often see that they have too many data points. And after 1 year, they say, we could do with less. For decision making, we could do with less. And it opens up the curriculum a bit, gives a bit more space with regard to this workload thing, but it also opens up the discussion about the essentials of the learning outcomes. Could we like remove this part of the curriculum? Could we do without this? What's the core of our curriculum that we want to maintain and that we want students to focus on and be able to use this feedback continuously? I think that's a bit, I could tell much more, but that's a bit what I just think, oh yes, this is what I see happening in practice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you said you could say much more. I think, Margaret, your question hit on what is one of the most popular questions in the chat here, which came in right at the end of your talk and has the second most upvotes, which is all about practical issues. And so Mitch Lowe has put in a longer question that I'll abbreviate a little bit, asking about the specifics of implementing programmatic assessment, and in particular, what planning tools you might use. Well, I think the real nuts and bolts of what this actually looks like. You've given us a bit of information about who is involved in the kind of setting. I wonder if there's more specificity you could give us to help to really grasp this thing.
Yes, the tools that people use is that they very practically usually have this overview of the learning outcomes and the data points, like this matrix thing that you might have for assessment anyway. Like, so the data points will be on one side and the learning outcomes. So you can see whether the data points altogether cover the different learning outcomes. That's a very practical thing that people always develop. The portfolio is quite important. We had some programs that didn't have a portfolio when they started, but those were like the early starters, so they didn't really mind, and it was okay for them to like improvise and build something themselves. But now we got to the stage that programs or people say like, I only want to implement programmatic assessment when I got a decent portfolio. And I think that's quite reasonable, as you really need the portfolio working really well, so students can enter the data points. Students can use the portfolio to ask feedback from workplace supervisors, from peers, etc. So you need good feedback forms. That's another thing that people always develop. So based on these learning outcomes, they develop feedback forms for the data points. So those are, and well, of course, discussion about who's going to be in the assessment committee at the end, how many people do we need? What different perspectives do we want to include here? Do we involve only teachers, workplace? So those are some of the practical things that come up when I think this is really how they, I hope that helps a bit. Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to ask about the similarity of data points between students. So, of course, in a professional education course, if they're getting feedback from clients, you know, those clients, you can't mandate particular pieces of feedback from clients in some ways. The reason I ask about the similarity of data points, though, how tailorable is it between students? So if students have different needs for what they can demonstrate, and if they're having quite different practicums and different experiences, how similar do they need to be to maintain the reliability of that judgment?
Very good question. When you ask me, it can be tailored, and for me, there's no need for similarity. But in practice, people usually start by developing a program with fixed data points. So data points determined by the program, because they want to be sure that students meet all, they have evidence, they have proof for all the learning outcomes. And also when students, first year students, then when they just enter a program, they find it very, very difficult to have so much freedom of choice. So what we usually see is that in the first year, there's quite a fixed program. So students feel transparency, they experience like, oh, I know what to expect, I know what to do, and then they gradually get more freedom. And in the end, it could be completely open, like this matrix I was just talking about. It could be completely open, and it's the student is responsible for filling in all the different data points and make sure that the data points he or she gathered cover all the different learning outcomes. So it could be like up to the student, but there usually are some kind of restraints or requirements, like you need different feedback perspectives. So not only from clients, for example, or you need different types of data points. I mean, the mix of data points is meant for students to be able to demonstrate their capabilities in different ways, but it shouldn't be the case that you have only written products or no written products at all. So that's usually a point of discussion, like what students should include in the portfolio and what can be left to the student.
What?
So this is a question that came in very early on from an anonymous attendee. Could programmatic assessments unintentionally advantage students with prior professional or experiential backgrounds, thereby introducing equity concerns into assessment practices?
Oh, right. I would like to answer two things. The first one is I would be very happy if when a student enters with experience in professional practice, that they can use this experience and like the data points I just described, why couldn't previous experience be used as a data point in a portfolio? So I would be very happy for a student with a lot of experience like to have this high stakes decision earlier. So because that's the way you could like shorten the time you need for getting a degree, for example. So I think that's not a real equity thing, but there is this, and I really, really feel the need to study this, as I recently hear from programs that they indeed feel that some students might be advantaged. For example, it's just from practice, so just some examples. Some people said that females are better at programmatic assessment, as it involves a lot of reflection and feedback gathering and interpreting feedback. And I said, oh, I just feel that women are better at this. Don't know, but, and another one is that we are going to study this is, for example, multilingual students, as it tends to rely a lot on written products, also written feedback, and it could disadvantage students who are less good in a certain language. And hopefully we are going to study like how could video recordings be part of the data points. Does feedback always have to be written? AI, for example, our ICT or our IT program, they are into Gen AI. So they use Gen AI as a feedback perspective. So it's one of the question marks connected to a data point. So I think there are some issues that I think need further investigation. But on the other hand, I mean, all assessment methods will like be better for better fit one student's needs than the other. So I think the most important thing is to consider that you have this mix of different data points, so all students get the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities in ways that suit them best.
Hi, Liesbeth. Raoul Mulder from the University of Melbourne. Thank you. That was such a stimulating seminar. It got me thinking about assessment, not of students, but of academics, and about the processes we currently have in place to do that, which have a lot of challenges around them. So we have committees evaluating academic performance, usually with quite a limited set of inputs, highly biased towards student evaluation scores. And so when I was thinking about data points, a sort of a lack of sufficiency of data points, a limited number of feedback perspectives, assessors that potentially come from a very traditional teaching and research mold that may not necessarily have expertise when they're assessing people who focus solely on teaching. I was just curious about whether or not the idea of a programmatic assessment model for academic promotions, etc., was something that had any research behind it.
I love that. I mean, when you look at all, this is an example of assessment, but there are many more, like for example, the accreditations. I don't know how it works in Australia, but in the Netherlands, accreditation is really high stakes for a program. And then a committee comes in for one day, and well, you could ask the same questions, like, is this good? Is this high quality decision making? Is it based on enough data points? I don't think so. But we do it for teacher professional development. We do this in our university. So teachers indeed gather data points, different data points, ask their students, ask fellow teachers, hand in different kinds of work. So we do this for teacher certification. We got this basic teaching qualification, as it's called, that all higher education teachers need to have. And we do it in the same way. And I really hate this focus on, for example, we got this national student survey thing, which I think is really not valid. But then it's used as a very important indicator of the quality of your course. And that's a bit more difficult to change, but I would love to change the perspective on how we evaluate the quality of higher education courses as well, and that it could be a bit more programmatic, or at least based on different data sources instead of really relying on one questionnaire. So thanks, I agree.
So the next question we'll go to online is from Leela Azuz. What is your advice with units that have large cohorts of more than 1,000 students, and how can they manage to give effective feedback? I think
Yes,
would like to answer this question.
Yes, that's a good one.
The challenge is some academics don't really get to know their students and can have different markers on different assessment tasks. So all they really have is the final grade of a student or their engagement data in a platform like Moodle. How can you make these decisions on individual students' work when you have so many students?
Yes, I think that's a difficult one. I mean, in the Netherlands, we usually don't have like over 1,000, but some of the courses I talked about have like 500, 600 enrollment yearly, so they're quite large. And the thing that would bother me most is maybe this mentoring system idea that I mean, all programs implemented a mentoring system to enable students to interpret and use feedback. So I can imagine if you have a good portfolio, that it's possible with a large group of students, as they can collect data points in their portfolio, use the portfolio to ask feedback. So it's actually automatically saved, and you can use the portfolio to aggregate the information. So you could ask students like, oh, for now do a self-reflection and look at the different patterns you see in the data points so far. So I think you could get quite far with that. So and I think the decision making usually is not that much of a problem. Usually the decision is quite clear, and you get this picture of all the different data points and the feedback students got. The decision making is not that difficult. So I would be worried more about the guidance that.
Can I ask one tiny clarifier on what you just
Yes.
said? The mentor group that you mentioned.
Yes.
Who made up the mentor group?
Sorry?
Who comprised the mentor group?
It's a coach or a teacher. Sometimes they call it a mentor or a coach, or it's just one of the teachers. And most of the programs have this system in place in which they have groups of, well, I just mentioned 8 to 10, but I know a program has 20 in each group, or 30, or a larger one had 50. So a group of 50 students. How do you say it? Supervised? Not really supervised, but there's one teacher who's responsible for this group of 50 students, and this teacher will help students with the interpretation of feedback, etc. And the funny thing is, we did this short questionnaire a couple of weeks ago, and we asked, how do you implement programmatic assessment, was one of the questions. And you really saw a difference between, like, some people said, this is really easy for us to implement a mentoring system, as we already have this in place. It's just we got the lessons planned. And I think that's very important, as assessment is embedded in education. So it shouldn't be like a bolt-on thing. When you got your lessons planned and you can use your lessons to interpret feedback from data points, I think it could be just a really good lesson. And they said, well, it's no problem planning this. We've got enough time because it's just part of our lessons. Whereas another part said, oh, we need more time, and time is really an issue, etc.
Could I just add
Yes.
a little addendum to that? That we did a study some years ago about feedback for learning, and looked at feedback in very large classes. It wasn't in the programmatic assessment context, but we have a website, feedbackforlearning.org, and there are case studies and detailed stuff on people doing really, really high quality feedback in massive classes, 1,000, 1,500 plus. So let's not accept the idea that you can't do good quality feedback in large classes. That is just not true.
Point taken.
Hi, Liesbeth. Peter Bannister from International University La Rioja in Spain. I'm just want to congratulate on your really interesting talk. My question is about cultures of resistance. So when we're talking about higher education systems in geographies which don't have kind of a tradition of programmatic assessment, how are we kind of combating that wall of resistance, which is, it's more workload, I don't want to do this, that kind of thing? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. How to answer this, because indeed, of course, you encounter resistance. It depends on the way it's, like I just said, it has the entire teacher team been taken along in this innovation. And usually the change is more difficult for teachers than for students. So you kind of see that the students take the teachers along. So they will ask different questions to the teachers, or the example of the students who commented on the feedback quality of the teachers. So, and very practically, what we do is like these walk-in sessions, so to call. So we have like we've lunches. So like, oh, do you have any question or any problem you want to raise, or just please feel free to walk in, and we will always address your issue and always try to help you get along. Those are just very practical things, but also you see that some teachers will leave. I mean, if they really feel like I don't fit the way of teaching and assessing in this course, we've seen teachers just leaving, looking for another job, or even when the program starts from scratch, that they hire teachers and they really ask, like, what do you feel about this way of assessing? Does it fit your perspective, etc.? But you need to involve the management as well.
As we carry on with small questions, but as well as things come up in the chat, if you're registered for this, whether you're in person or online, you will get a follow-up message saying where the recording is accessible for you to access. So any more online, Jack?
We have more questions online than we know what to do with, actually. So it's been a really rich discussion online. I'm going to go to a question from Stacey Carter, who is asking again, on this theme of implementing programmatic assessment. You've just been talking about, working with the educators side. What about introducing programmatic assessment to students for the first time? Can you speak to that?
Yes. Very practically, some programs implemented detox weeks, as they call it. So to really introduce students into the program and how it works and why it works that way. I used to work in a course that uses programmatic assessment as well. I had to quit that one as I started in Maastricht University a month ago. But in this course, what you really notice, we introduce students into the concept of programmatic assessment on the first day. Then they start with their first data point, their first assignment, they get feedback. And then when they get feedback for the first time, we help them and then they realize suddenly oh, I got some negative feedback here, but it doesn't mean anything. I mean, in the sense that it doesn't have any consequences that I will have to redo this assignment, because that's not what we do. So you can have this assignment, and the first assignment can be quite bad. So to say, when the student is not that good yet, you would say, well, the first data point is not really up to scratch. They get negative feedback, and then they realize, oh, so it means I have to take the feedback along. So I'm not revising this assignment. I understand that some things didn't go really well, but now in the next assignment, I will try to do it differently. And that's really this moment of realization that it's not like a normal assessment that they are used to. So the students I really have to admit that they experience uncertainty. They are asking for transparency. Tell me what to do. Tell me, will this be sufficient? Of course, they ask these questions. And you need to give them some time to get adjusted and to really, along the way, after a couple of months, and we got the decisions made on a yearly basis. So only at the end of the year, they will get a high stakes decision. So they got some time to get used to it before it really has any consequences. Does that help?
Someone in the room.
Thank you. Is that on? Thanks, Liesbeth. Hannah Bornstein from RMIT. You've got me thinking when you say about time for the students to adjust to this new way of thinking. And I'm curious, based on your experience, whether you're having any conversations or dialogue with high schools, secondary schools. It feels like there could be a lot that they could help guide our students, a smoother transition into first year. These conversations are happening a lot around higher ed. It just feels like first year they're often land in this alien world. So curious to hear your perspective. Is programmatic assessment being embedded in secondary high schools? Is there elements that we could adjust there? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I must admit, in the Netherlands, talking about a different assessment culture, secondary education is really focused on marks. And I told this story here to some colleagues. My son and my daughter are in secondary school, and my son came home with this English test that he got a really bad mark on. And I said, oh, let's have a look. I thought, assessment for learning. Now you can put it into practice. So I took a look at this assignment with him, and then he had to write something, and it was an English assignment, and he had to write like something about a restaurant. I don't remember, but he told me like, oh, and I got this beautiful idea of what I wanted to tell, but then I tried to write it down in English and I didn't know the words. And so he got like one of the 12 points he could gain. So what I did, and I felt very bad, I told him, well, the next time you have to write down a number of words and sentences you know. And then you're not going to start with, oh, I want to tell this beautiful story, but you're going to start with this. These are the words I know, and I will write down something as simply as possible using the words I know. That's really bad, isn't it, as a mother? But that's the way assessment in secondary school is like. So I would like to nudge the system a little bit, but I think we have a long way to go there.
We have one more question in the time, so we'll go online for just one question. So what's the best of the ones remaining?
The next most popular it comes from Priya, and you've talked a little bit about what I'm going to ask, but I think there are some other elements in this question that are worth talking through. Priya asks, there are high stakes decisions can be undertaken in professional programs with well-defined competency frameworks. How can this work in programs like the sciences and humanities, where students' progression comes from multiple data points in very different programs? And I know you've said before, not programmatic assessment isn't necessarily for everything, but the inclusion of high stakes in this question, I think, is the interesting part. What do we need the potential for that high stakes element for this to work?
I don't completely understand the high stakes element in here. Could you explain a bit more?
Yeah.
Or
so the first part of the question asks or states, high stakes decisions can be undertaken in professional programs,
yes,
with a well-defined competency framework.
So the thing is that you need a clear competency framework that's true for high stakes decision making, definitely. And also for learning, because that's the pathway that students are following, and that you're collecting data points and that you're getting the feedback. So it's having this competency framework is extremely, extremely important. So I sometimes do wonder, in the Netherlands, we have these courses that are really what you would maybe call academic courses. And indeed, they are made up of different units or modules addressing a different topic. And when I ask them, do you have something like that goes in between, or something that students are building on all the time? And when they haven't got this, then you need that first. Then there's no framework to base any high stakes decision on. No, you definitely need that.
Well, I'd like to wind this up, and thank you once again, Liesbeth, for briefing. I think the last question is indicative of the fact that we actually need to think very carefully about assessment, whether we're going to move in the direction of programmatic assessment or not. So there's a lot of kind of hard level, careful thinking we need to do about assessment in all of our programs. And this provides one strategy and a whole lot of tools and a whole lot of concepts that we might be able to utilize, either if we're moving in the programmatic direction or if we're doing other things as well. So thank you very much for that. Elizabeth will be around longer in CRADLE.
Yes, feel free
so
to.
if you do want to kind of reach out to her, then she will be around. So once again, thank you very much. And don't forget the next seminar on the 9th of April. Thank you.